Hey everyone, this is Caroline with Fiveable, and tonight we're talking about community ecology, so I'm glad you're here. As always, if you want access to slides early, you want your own copy of the slides, you want to look through, oops, pulled up the wrong document. You want to look through any of my notes or any additional materials, sign up for Fiveable Plus, which is just $25 right now, but will increase in price closer to the AP exam. So definitely hop on that train. You can find that information on the website. But for tonight, we'll focus on community ecology, building off of last week when we talked more about basic ecology and then population ecology. I think I said this last week, but just to reiterate, the great thing about ecology is if you're a confident reader and a confident graph reader, then you're usually pretty good with this, because a lot of it's logic and just being able to determine why relationships would be happening. And the other thing is, if you've had ecology in like a freshman bio or an intro bio class, not too much gets added on at the AP level. So that's kind of like a nice thing, whereas usually we're adding 15 different layers of complexity this year. This is not truly the case as much for ecology. So I'll pull up our PowerPoint. Okay. Go. Whenever this decides to load. It's weird, my computer's time is off. Okay, cool. All right, so what is ecology? We already talked about it, but it's the relationship amongst organisms as well as between organisms and their environment. If you were with us last week, we talked mainly about populations, and populations are groups of organisms that are the same species in the same area. So tonight we're going to talk about community ecology, which is the relationship amongst different species in a common environment. So I have this just random little example here where we have an eagle, a toucan, a spider monkey, a jaguar, and the tree all coexisting in the same area. So different species, but same general area. And again, that area is kind of up to our own determination. Are any of you guys playing March Mammal Madness? March Mammal Madness? Anybody? Oh man, you really should check it out. I'm going to post the link because speaking of community ecology, this is a perfect segue. So March Mammal Madness is basically March Madness, if you're familiar with the NCAA basketball tournament, but where mammals, not all mammals, used to be all mammals, now it's a mix of organisms, are fake fighting against one another in a battle to the death. It's not actually to the death because that would be a criminal indictment right there. But it's really, really cool, and it shows how different organisms interact and why, and there's a lot of science behind it, and it's put on by really, really amazing scientists, and you can read more about it in the post that I just posted. But I have my kids filling out a bracket right now, and there's a big competition tonight, so just kind of interesting. You can take a look in your free time if you want to geek out a little bit. It's like March Madness for nerds. That's what I tell my kids, at least. Okay. So just a reminder from population ecology, we were taking a look at, again, same species, same area. So you can take a look here. These were some of the graphics that we looked at last week. I think we pulled up together the human population clock, and we took a look at the percent of the population in the United States at various age ranges. So you can determine a lot from these guys about a population. If it's rapidly growing, the majority of its population is young, so they're going to grow older and then reproduce. If it's slow growth, then we have kind of like a rectangle figure where we have about an equal distribution at every age range. Then if it's zero growth or a decline, we actually have less children than we do adults. So those adults are not going to be replaced by the next generation. So just kind of a refresher there. If you want more information on all the population ecology stuff, you can watch the replay from last week's episode. But it can tell you a lot about the health of a population by looking at graphs like this. So again, when we're talking about community ecology, a lot of that is going to be studying the movement of energy amongst organisms, because that's really how organisms interact, right, is through the transfer of energy, through eating one another, right? That's a major way that organisms interact. And so that's going to be a big focus here. So show you a couple different diagrams, and then we'll learn a little bit more. I'm sure you guys have learned about trophic levels before with producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. So this is going to be hopefully mainly just review and just a little refresher. So I like this diagram for a lot of reasons. So next week we'll talk more about chemical cycling, which are like nutrient cycles, like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, etc. Things that you've probably learned about before. And what you'll notice is energy cycles, chemicals cycle, which is the blue arrows here, whereas energy flows truly in one direction for the most part, from the sun to primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. We won't worry as much about the microorganisms and other detrivores over here, but it's really flowing in one direction, and we're going to lose a lot of energy in this process. That energy is being released at each level by heat. And by heat, it's basically like the energy that's needed to keep that organism alive. It's metabolism. Truly, it's heat, like maintaining its body temperature, but really like the entire energy process of keeping an organism alive. And a lot of that is going to be lost. I say lost, but energy cannot be created nor destroyed. So really, it's just transformed into a different format. And that's going to be a big focus for this week, as opposed to the true chemical cycling that we'll see like when we talk about the water cycle and things next week. Okay, so when we're talking community ecology, and again, we're showing the flow of energy, we're talking about the flow of energy between trophic levels. So TROPHIC, trophic levels. And those are the levels of that are truly based off of the diet of the organism, so what it eats and what eats it. Okay, so you can see in this example, so the bottom of our diagram has our producers, and producers are always going to make up the largest portion of any food chain, any food web, any diagram that you see. They are the most important because they produce all of the energy for every other level, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next page. They're going to be our bottom level. So then we have primary consumers that are chomping on just those plants. And so that's going to be all the herbivores. So we have an elk, rabbit, and field mouse there. Then secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and then tertiary consumers eat at least one secondary consumer. They may also eat a primary consumer. They may also eat a producer. Usually tertiary consumers are carnivores though. Secondary consumers may also eat producers. They may be omnivores. Oftentimes they are, like humans oftentimes fall into a secondary consumer kind of range. But the distinguishing fact of that tertiary consumer is that it's eating at least one secondary consumer, which is what makes it a tertiary consumer. They're the least common. We have the least of them. They're usually like those apex predators that don't really have predators of their own. So hawks, eagles, sharks, wolves, bears, right? Like if a wolf and a bear ran into each other in the woods, they'd be like, hey, and then walk away. Like they're not going to fight one another. So things up there are kind of the top of the food chain, literally, which is why they say that, because it's all the way at the top. Okay, so speaking of that energy business, so this is a pyramid just supposed to be like a little representation of how energy transfers and does not transfer between trophic levels. So you'll notice here that producers, if we say they start with 100% of the energy, the primary consumers that eat them get 10% of that energy, okay? And then the secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers get 1% of that energy. And then the tertiary consumers that eat the secondary consumers get 0.1% of that energy. So there's a lot less energy available to tertiary consumers based on their diet of secondary consumers, because there's so much energy loss between each trophic level, the energy needed to keep that organism alive, that tertiary consumers have to eat a lot more than primary consumers. So like by body weight, if you looked at how much food a hawk eats versus a mouse, and you accounted for the fact that there are size differences there, a hawk eats a lot more food per pound or kilogram of itself than a mouse does, because its energy sources are actually less beneficial, and there's a ton of energy loss in between our trophic levels here. Oh, my sound is echoey. Uh-oh. Okay, let me close the door. Okay. Let me know if it's still not great. I can also try to talk closer to the computer so I'm not so far away. All right. Cool. So that makes sense so far. We're losing energy. You've probably heard this before, that we lose 90%, only transfer 10% of energy between trophic levels. And again, when I say loss, it's not really loss because matter cannot be, or energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It's just being transformed. Okay, so just a quick diagram for your own information. We've talked about all these, but producers are organisms that produce their own energy. So plants are obviously the major ones in that category, but it's also important to remember like the photosynthetic bacteria and the algae that also exist in this area that are producing their own energy. Important thing to remember about producers is that all energy on Earth, ingestible energy on Earth, comes from a producer. Even carnivores are getting 100% of their energy from a producer, right? So it comes from the sun, it gets converted, obviously. And the reason I say even tertiary consumers or carnivores get all their energy from producers is because their energy source got their energy from a producer, right? So you can tie everything back to the beginning here. So even if a wolf is eating a fox and the fox ate the mouse and the mouse ate the grass, the original energy still came from the grass. Okay, so that's the fun thing about producers. So sometimes students have been like, oh, we wouldn't die without plants. Like, oh, sorry, that's my dog's tail. She's just chilling over here. We wouldn't die without plants because I would only eat meat. It's like, well, your meat has to eat, right? And your meat's going to eat a producer. And so therefore, our energy pyramid is going to fall. Addie, stop. Okay, so then we have our primary consumers. Primary consumers, again, they only eat producers. They're usually herbivores, deer, sheep, zebras, giraffes. Those are all good examples of primary consumers. Secondary consumers then eat primary consumers and sometimes also producers. Snakes, frogs, rats, fish can all be secondary consumers, but it really depends on the food web that you're looking at, because a snake could also potentially be a tertiary consumer depending on what type of mouse or rodent it's eating. It really just depends. So secondary consumers are kind of in-betweens, and that can vary depending on the environment. And then our tertiary consumers have the ability to eat organisms at the secondary level. Heterotrophic, mostly carnivores. Eagles, wolves, sharks are all going to be examples of that. So again, those are like your apex predators at the top. Okay, easy enough. Hopefully this is familiar vocab for you. Okay, so with all of these things, right, so here's a food web right here. We are going to construct some food webs, and you will have to analyze some food webs for the AP exam. It's really important to remember a few rules. So one, the arrows always point from the thing being eaten to the thing doing the eating, from prey to predator. A lot of times students want to draw like a picture of a lion and a zebra, and they draw the arrow from the lion to the zebra because the lion is coming to the zebra and eating it. And that's all well and good, but the zebra is not getting any energy from being eaten by the lion, and that's the goal of the food web, is to show the transfer of energy. Sorry. So you're always going to have your arrows pointing from the thing being eaten to the thing doing the eating. Other rule that we already talked about, 10% of energy is transferred, 90% is lost. And then lastly, our producers always make up the largest portion of a food web, and they are the most full of energy. So if we go back a second, this energy diagram is also the same as the biomass diagram of these things. So a vast proportion of living things on Earth are producers. The next vast proportion would be primary consumers, then secondary, then tertiary. And if you remember when we talked last week about the wolves and the caribou population, there was the two axes, and the scale for the wolves was like infinitely smaller than the scale for the caribou. And that's because there's just a lot less tertiary consumers in environments and in the world than there are secondary, primary, and producers. Okay, so here's an example of a kind of complex food web. Just so that you guys are familiar, because you might have to analyze something like this. So you would need to be able to determine what would happen if we removed one of these things. So I could ask you, or they could ask you in a free response question, what would happen if humans overfished the waters in this environment, and what would be the lasting effects here? So if we remove fish, right, we're going to have a lot of different problems, because now we're losing a food source for birds, for squid, and for seals, right? So the bird, squid, and seals population is all going to decrease. If the bird, squid, and seal population decreases, then so are the smaller toothed whales, the elephant seals, and then potentially sperm whales and baleen whales as well. And then we would probably see an overpopulation of krill and copepods, because those things would be eaten too much Oh, she's fine. Or they wouldn't be eaten at all by the fish, and therefore we would have this increased population of krill and copepods because they don't have their predator with them anymore. Okay, so it's really important to think about those kinds of things. We would consider something maybe like a fish to be a keystone species, usually something towards the top of a food web that has a vast impact on other things. We'll talk more about those in a little bit, but when you remove that thing, you're going to see a huge shift in the top and bottom end of this food chain, with the bottom end increasing too rapidly and the top end decreasing due to their lack of food. So again, ecology is not too hard as long as you can think critically about what would happen if certain things change in the population. Okay, so we're going to segue then into some relationships amongst all of these species, because it's not all predator-prey, although we'll talk about that. There's also other ways that organisms can interact within systems besides, again, just eating one another, which happens. So some other community relationships or things that, or ways that things can interact. So we have symbiosis. Wow. Oh, my words are struggling today. And the examples of that would be parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. And then there are predator-prey relationships, which are very straightforward. So parasitism is going to be a relationship in which one species benefits and one species is harmed. I'm sure you've all heard of parasites before, so I have some pictures here. Ticks, mosquitoes, things that are going to bite, suck your blood, they're benefiting. Obviously, they're getting a meal. And the victim of that is not benefiting because they're losing blood, they're getting itchy marks, whatever it may be, they're having scratches, bumps, all those things. But the parasite is indeed benefiting. So other typical parasites like tapeworms and things like that, if you really want to lose your appetite and lose a lot of sleep, you can watch Monsters Among Us. Maybe you already have in your AP class. I actually watched it when I took AP Bio. When I was a freshman in high school a long, long time ago. And it scarred me for life. Like, it still scarred me however many years later, like 14 years later. So not great. Okay, anyway, parasites, pretty easy. Most people are familiar with that one. Commensalism is going to be a little rarer. It's a relationship in which one organism benefits and the other is not harmed or helped. So it's just kind of a neutral response there. So this is an example of some fish that follow this shark around. The shark is not harmed or helped by their presence, but the fish kind of get protection, obviously, because they're very close to a shark and most things aren't going to attack that shark. And then they also get leftover scraps from the shark's meal. So they're definitely benefiting. The shark is not being harmed or helped there. Another common commensalist example is barnacles on whales. So barnacles are little growths. I don't even know what kind of, subset. Oh, it's an arthropod. Okay, so it's an arthropod. They grow, it's kind of like a little clam, but it's stationary. And so they grow on rocks, they grow on boats, things like that. But the most beneficial relationship is when they can grow on a whale. The whale is not harmed or hurt by that. They don't care. They probably don't even know. Their skin's very thick. But the whale moves, right? And when the whale is moving through the water is rushing past those barnacles, and they're able to get particles of kelp and krill and all sorts of algae and things because they're moving through the water, and water's moving past them more quickly than it would be if they formed on a stationary surface. So that's another example of a commensalist relationship. And then lastly, one that you also might be pretty familiar with is mutualism, which is obviously a relationship in which both organisms benefit. So flower and bee, classic pollinator and pollinatee. So bees get nectar from flowers. They're attracted to them for a reason, because the flower, it's an evolutionary advantage for the flower to rub its pollen off on the bee, and then when the bee goes to another flower, it pollinates that flower, and they have more genetic diversity and variation in their population, which we know is the key to a healthy population from learning about evolution. Another one, everyone's favorite example, is the sea anemone, I sound like Nemo now, and the clownfish from Nemo. So the clownfish, they both kind of provide protection for each other. The clownfish will also bring food to the sea anemone with it, traveling with it, and it provides a home and shelter for the clownfish. Also on the right, there's the zebra and the oxpecker. So these birds will just sit on the zebra and eat ticks and other parasites off of it. The bird benefits from getting a nice meal, and the zebra benefits by not having parasites on it anymore. There's actually an entire division. So if you're familiar with March Madness, you know there's 4 divisions. So there's an entire division in March Mammal Madness devoted to mutualist relationships. It's called the tag team division, and those animals get to fight together in their battles. So that's pretty interesting. Yeah. Okay. Any questions about any of those? Cool. All right, and so then last, predator-prey, obviously pretty straightforward. So predator, organism that preys upon another organism, and prey, an organism that is preyed upon. Important to remember though, a predator could also be prey in a different situation, and prey could also be a predator, right? So those secondary consumers are oftentimes going to be both predator and prey. Like a snake might eat a mouse, but be eaten by a hawk, right? So then it serves as both predator and prey. And the populations of predators and prey are going to kind of chase one another, because as the predator population increases, the prey population will start to decrease. But as the prey starts to decrease, now the predators have lost their food, so their population will start to decrease, which means the prey's population will start to increase again. They kind of just chase after one another like that, because they both are so dependent on one another in order to either survive or not. Okay, so those are the basics to community ecology. There's not a whole lot to it as long as you're familiar with trophic levels, energy diagrams, food webs, and our symbiotic relationships, which we just went through. Those are really the key points here. So I have, I think, 2, I'm forgetting, blanking, 2 free response practices that we can go through. Yeah, which should be pretty straightforward. And because I like to show you guys real life examples of ecology in action. And then I think this one's from 2017, I forget now. We'll be good to go. I'll probably finish a little early tonight. I don't know how the weather is where you are, but in Chicago, we finally got a little bit warm. I think it's 55 degrees out right now, which feels like the dead of summer in comparison to the weather that we've had. Okay, so here is our first practice problem. So this was, I believe, in 2017, question 4. So this would be a 4-point question. And I can show you how you can find where the points are based on the bolded words in the question. Okay, so you'll see we have this table up at the top. So the table above shows how much each organism in an aquatic ecosystem relies on various food sources. The rows represent the organisms in the ecosystem, and the columns represent the food source. Okay, so it's an important distinction. Percentages indicate the proportional dietary composition of each organism. High percentages indicate strong dependence of an organism on a food source. A, based on the food source indicated in the data table, construct a food web in the template below. Write each organism's name on the appropriate lines and draw the arrows necessary to indicate the energy flow between organisms in the ecosystem. That's going to be 2 points, one for the bolded word of construct a food web, and the second is after that and, drawing the arrows. They should have had that bolded as well. Then part B, in an effort to control the number of midges, an area within the ecosystem was sprayed with fungus, which significantly decreased the midge population. Based on the data in the table, predict whether the spraying of the fungus will have the greatest short-term impact on the population of the stoneflies, caddisflies, or hellgrammits. I don't know if that's how you say any of those, so I just guess every time, and justify your prediction. So we get a point for our prediction. So that's just going to be a name of one of those 3 things. And then we get a point for justifying using data. That's what that means. Use the data in the table. It's really important that you start to become familiar with the bolded words and what they mean in free response questions. So I'll always try to highlight them as we're going through them. Okay. So here was the diagram then that was included below. So it showed the midges here in the middle, and then it had 4 lines for the other 4 species and shows that this is the increasing trophic level. Okay, all right, so I'm gonna put this up real quick. I want you guys to start thinking. I'll give you like a minute or 2 to start thinking how you think, like what needs to be at the bottom here, okay? And then what you think is gonna be the other 3 levels based on increasing trophic level here. So I'll give you about a minute to think and then I'll show you the answer. Okay, so hopefully the first thing that you were able to notice is that our producer is algae, and hopefully that's kind of like a given as well. But you can also know that algae is our producer because it has zero food sources, because it gets all its energy from the sun. So because it's not eating anything, it's going to be at the very bottom here on this line, okay? Then we have midges, and midges only eat algae, so they come next, okay? And now we have three other things to place: stoneflies, hellgrammots, and caddisflies. So let's take a look at their diet. So stoneflies eat midges and caddisflies, okay? So in my head, what I'm thinking is stoneflies have to be above midges. They also have to be above caddisflies because they eat the caddisfly, and therefore they are at a higher trophic level. Okay, so I know that stoneflies cannot go here, and I have to pick between these two spots for it. Hellgrammots eat stoneflies, midges, and caddisflies. They eat everything. Okay, so that's going to tell me pretty quickly that they're going to need to be at the top of the food chain here. And then caddisflies only eat midges and algae, so they're a good fit for the second line as the second lowest trophic level. Pretty easy to kind of work your way through this. And then to show the arrows of energy flow, you would just need to add the few arrows that are missing. So you need to add an arrow between the algae down here. I'm going to show you this on the next slide, but between the algae and the caddisfly, because it's eating the algae, and then between the respective other organisms and who's eating them. So it should look something like this: algae, caddisfly, stonefly, hellgrammot, with arrows showing the other organism relationships based on who's eating who. Super simple. So you get a point for all organisms placed on the appropriate lines and a point for having all arrows correctly drawn. So those were an easy 2 points. That's a question that you want to see because you can logic your way through that. So then part B, in an effort to control the number of midges and area, oh right, so we're killing off the midges, and we want to know whether the fungus is going to have who this fungus is going to have the greatest short-term impact on. Okay, so that's when you want to look at the column to see who eats midges, and you'll notice that 90% of the stonefly's diet is midges, and therefore they would have the greatest short-term impact in comparison to the hellgrammots and caddisflies, who only get 10 or 30% of their diet from midges. Okay, and that's exactly how you need to answer it. So you get a point for saying stoneflies, and then you would get a point for saying that 90% of their diet comes from midges, and therefore they would be the most affected in comparison to hellgrammots and caddisflies. So you'll notice that this justification, if you read through it in your head, both of them have caddisflies and hellgrammots mentioned, and for the most part, AP will not give you a point unless you mention all of that information. So if you say stoneflies have the highest dependence on midges, period, you probably wouldn't get the point. Or stoneflies require 90% of their diet from midges, you probably wouldn't get the point. You need to compare it to the other two because that's how you decided that they would have the greatest short-term impact in comparison to the other two. So you have to mention them. So always over-explain in those situations. If you're like, oh, I'll just write that it's stoneflies because it's 90%, you're probably going to miss out on an easy point of information that you knew but just didn't put on the page. Okay, next question. Some birds, including great spotted cockatoos, lay their eggs in the nests of other birds, such as reed warblers. Or, I'm sorry, cuckoos, not cockatoos. The warbler parents raised the unrelated chicks and provide them with food that would otherwise be given to their biological offspring. A researcher conducted an investigation to determine the type of relationship between warblers and cuckoos in an environment without predators. The researcher found that nests containing only warblers were more likely to be successful than nests containing warblers and cuckoos. A successful nest is defined as a nest where at least one chick becomes an adult. Okay? In some geographic areas, several species of nest predators are present. Researchers have found that cuckoo chicks, while in the nest, produce a smelly substance that deters nest predators. The substance does not remain in the nest if cuckoo chicks are removed. Figure 1 shows the probability that nests containing only warblers or workers and cuckoos will be successful in an environment with predators. In a follow-up experiment, the researchers add cuckoos to a nest that contains only warblers and remove cuckoos from the nest containing warblers and cuckoos. So you'll notice that when predators are present, there is a higher chance of survival if the nest has warblers and cuckoos versus, I think I'm missing a graph here, which is my bad. I can post this question. This is from 2018. Okay, we take a look. Yeah, I think I'm totally missing a graph here. Oh yeah, what did I do? Oh no, it's not that one. It's not on the scoring guideline. Yikes. Anyway, so we need to try this one instead. This will just be the questions. I think it's question 6. Let's see. It's on page. No. Well. Anyway, okay, so it just doesn't have that picture. And we're going to skip one of these questions anyway. But the main idea is that we need to describe the symbiotic relationship that exists between the cuckoo and warbler in an environment without predators, and then identify the symbiotic relationship that exists between the cuckoo and the warbler in the presence of predators. Okay, and we can do all of this just from the reading. So without predators, it's determined that the nests containing only warblers were more successful because the warblers are giving their food to the cuckoo babies instead of their own offspring. So that's one organism benefiting, the cuckoo, and one organism being harmed, the warbler, because it's giving food to the wrong baby. Okay, so that's going to be a classic example of parasitism. The cuckoos are parasites. The cuckoo benefits from the relationship and the warbler is harmed by the relationship. Either of those, so you didn't even need to know the vocab word, as long as you could say cuckoo benefits, warbler's harmed. Super easy because that's explicitly listed in the question. You just needed to restate it. Then you needed to be able to take a look at this graph and determine that when warblers and cuckoos are present in the presence of predators, and I think this is what trips students up because there's just like a lot of moving parts here, that the warblers and cuckoos did better together. So that would be an example of mutualism. So if you just said it's a mutualistic relationship or both organisms benefit, you got the point there. And the other point came from a graph that you had to make, but because it's really hard to make that through a screencast, I didn't include that part, but you can take a look at it because it's in the ones that I sent you. But yeah, so just through reading that, you were able to determine, oh yeah, this is a parasitic relationship. Oh yeah, this is a mutualist relationship because both organisms are benefiting or one is benefiting as one is being harmed. Okay, so easy enough there. Okay, so that's actually all I have tonight. That went by quicker than I expected, but also there's not too much to talk about with community ecology, which is why I threw in those practice questions. But if anyone has any questions, I can certainly answer them for you. Otherwise, next week we're talking about nutrient cycles and succession, and I may throw in some human impact in there, stuff in there too. So any questions? Sessions last anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. It really depends. Depends on if people have questions. It depends on what we're talking about. Sometimes I can, how many sessions have I had so far? That's a great question. Probably 20. A lot. And most of them are like 40, 45-ish minutes at least. Usually they don't go this quick. I could look for sure. But yeah, probably at least 20 sessions. Yes, I can totally go over the difference between commensalism and mutualism. So in commensalism, one organism benefits and one organism is not helped or harmed. They just kind of exist. Like the whales aren't being helped or harmed by the barnacles growing on them. So it's not giving them an advantage. It's not giving them a disadvantage. Same with the fish that swim right next to those sharks. The sharks are not given an advantage or a disadvantage, but the other organism is benefiting. And in mutualism, both benefit. So there has to be a benefit to both individuals. So in the example that we just did in that free response, the cuckoo is benefiting because they're getting food and shelter, and the warbler is benefiting because the cuckoo babies are putting off a smell that's preventing predators from attacking the nest. In the example with the zebra and the oxpecker, the zebra is getting parasites removed off of it, which is good. It would be like if someone came and took ticks or something off of you, and the bird is benefiting from getting food. So mutualism, they both have to have some sort of advantage, and commensalism, one has the advantage and one is just not affected. It has a neutral effect. Any other questions? You can watch all of my replays. So I started at the beginning of the year. I think my first session was in early September. So I probably have had more than 20 sessions actually, talking about all things evolution. Then we moved into talking about cells, cellular transport, cell membrane, various organelles. Then we moved into talking about cellular respiration, photosynthesis. We talked about Hardy-Weinberg. We've talked about chi-squared, genetics. I'm blanking on all the other topics we've covered: transcription, translation, gene regulation, yeah, all sorts of stuff. So it's all there. So if you subscribe to Fiveable, you can get access to all of that and all of my PowerPoint slides and replays of all of those things, which is good for cramming before the AP exam, which is like 7.5 weeks away, or maybe it's 8.5. I think it's 7.5 school weeks because spring break's in there. Any other questions? We feel okay? Cool. We'll tune in next week. We'll start wrapping up on ecology because it's really pretty straightforward. I'll try to show you some more practice problems because we can start practicing some more free response, because that's usually what trips students up the most. And the more free response you look at and the more rubrics you read through, the more you'll be able to figure out exactly what the College Board is looking for from those. Okay. So tune in next week. I'll definitely include some free response practices. Otherwise, have a great night. Enjoy the warmth if you have it, and the sun if you have it. And I will talk to you guys next week. See you guys.